Well, welcome to the Ordinary Way podcast. I am one of the hosts, Lupe Acevedo, and my good buddy, Ryan Ham. And so we do want to make a note. Another one of our hosts, Brian Nutt, is absent at the moment, but we do ask if you could be praying for him and his family as they have lost an uncle, and so he's taking care of that. And so prayers for him and his family, and we hope to have him with us in the next episode. But for today, we continue the conversation of the cultural values of the West Plains Conference and the Global Methodist Church. And so, in the last episode, we talked about kingdom over castles. And today, we are going to be talking about a culture of calling. And so I want to ask, what if the biggest misunderstanding in the church today is not about belief, but about calling? And what if calling isn't just for pastors, missionaries, or church leaders, but for everyone? Many people assume, right, I'm just a church member. I'm not called like that. But what if that isn't true? A culture of calling is the conviction that every believer is personally called by God into a life of discipleship and mission. Os Guinness writes a fantastic book called The Call, where he states every person is called by God, to God, and for God. And so let's break that down because this is actually where everything begins. And so, what does it mean to be called by God? Well, calling begins with God's initiative, not our ambition. Right? I know we tend to pat each other on the back when we make the decision to follow Jesus, but the fact is God has been seeking after us, calling on us, wooing us to Him the entire time. If anything, we just finally have opened our eyes and our ears to recognize it. But what it means to be called by God, it means that our purpose is not determined by our striving, our career goals, or desires for personal success. That are instead uh, we are we are designed, and all of those things are actually started by God. And so this idea removes the pressure to manufacture our own purpose. And so here's a question, Ryan: would you say that you tend to think of your life as something you design or something God is directing?
Ooh, I think if I'm being honest, I think my default is to try to design it. That might be a lot of people's or majority's default to just try to design it. We like having control, work, tangible things that we can work with.
Mhm.
I like having a plan and knowing where I'm going or just the feeling of control there. But the more, I've walked with God, the more I've realized the most meaningful parts of my life were not by my choosing,
Mhm.
if that makes any sense.
Right. Yeah. 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 Well, yeah. Because right, I no, I hear what you're saying. Because right, there's moments where I wanted certain things, I prayed for them, and God said no, and that's exactly what needed to happen.
Yeah. I use example, meeting my wife, that was nothing ever planned for. It was
Mhm.
just right there in the moment. I saw her, I had to talk to her.
Yeah.
I don't know why, but I
Right.
felt it. I had to go sit at that table with her and just introduce myself.
Right. Yeah.
And then it was history.
Right. Yeah. Well, and I think even too, even when we make decisions and not realizing, um, things that have been set in motion and put in place even before. I think about, we talk about prevenient grace. And again, we go back to, right, that moment we say yes to God. And it's not until we move beyond that moment that we look back even before and we realize, man, um, there's all these little pieces of the puzzle that are being put together slowly. And so, no, I think I would agree. I think the tendency is, you know, life is something that we design, and it makes sense, right? We kind of determine, or I guess not determine. That's something we hear constantly. Growing up. I think about, what we're getting into April, May's coming up soon, so there's going to be a lot of kids graduating high school. I can think back and right, that's typically what you hear, right? It's you're going to leave, you're going to make something of yourself, and so keep in mind, the decisions that you make, making sure you keep God at the center of your life, and so forth. Um, and so even as I share that, like, yes, some of it is our design, and what I mean by that is right, we have to walk in it, but there are things that God has set beforehand, and I think the one of the biggest things that I think we wrestle with is trying to align both of those things together. But no. Well, the second thing, so right, if every person is called by God, and every person is called to God, and so what Os Guinness means by that is we're first called to relationship before responsibility. We're called to abide before we act. Jesus expands on this in John chapter 15 when he describes himself as the vine and we are the branches. Apart from him, we can do nothing, but if we remain in him, we bear fruit. We are not first called to do something, we are called to be with someone, and his name is Jesus. And so, what tends to come first in your life, being with God or doing for God?
Ooh. I think it's really easy to flip those two around without realizing it. You can spend so much time doing things for God, preparing, serving, helping others, that you start to neglect actually being with Him.
Mm,
And I think the scary part is you can still look really productive on the outside,
mm,
but I've noticed when I'm not abiding, when I'm not spending real time with Jesus, I start running empty.
mm,
I have less patience. My perspective gets skewed,
yeah.
and all that, all the time spent preparing and serving, helping, it feels more like pressure than purpose. you know. So I've had to learn to fight for that being with God time, not as another task, but as a source for something else. A source for my spiritual soul.
Mm, yeah. So what comes to my mind as you're kind of talking, is Matthew 7:22, and it says, I'm looking at my phone. It says, "Many will say to me on that day, Lord, Lord, did we not prophesy in your name, and in your name drive out demons, and in your name perform many miracles?" Continues on and on. And the thing that Jesus holds against them is, "I never knew you." And there's a difference between knowing someone and knowing about someone. I think there's a lot of people who know about Jesus, but do we know Jesus? We only learn to know someone deeply and intimately by being with them. And I'll be one of the first ones to admit, especially as a pastor, doing for God, doing for God, doing for God. And if not doing for God, doing for other people, doing for other people, doing for other people. That it's easy, but you said it right. Right, there's this moment where it feels like we're empty. Another way people have put it is, you can't give what you don't have.
Yeah.
You can't give Jesus away if Jesus isn't in your heart. And I'm not talking about, right, again, right, inviting Jesus into your heart. I'm talking about, again, spending time with him. That goes back to, the John 15 thing, right? It's, are we connected to the vine in such a way that the source of our strength, the source of our power, the source of everything that is necessary to do the things that God's called us to do, are they coming from our own will, or are they coming from Jesus? And so, um, the third thing is, we are called for God. And what Os Guinness means by this is, we are sent into the world to live on mission. Our life has direction, purpose, and assignment. We are not just saved, we are sent. And so our identity shifts from performance to calling. When we misunderstand calling, we drift into unhealthy ways of living out our faith. It keeps us from becoming performance driven, which says, I just need to do more for God, or position driven, which says only leaders or pastors are called to do ministry and mission. Instead, we should say, I am called, therefore I live sent. And so, without a culture of calling, churches tend to drift into three different things. The first is uh, program dependency, and we see this a lot. Uh, there is a large trust in programs instead of disciple making relationships, and so we can bring in a crowd with a single program, which is great, but are we reproducing effective disciples who make effective disciples? Or are we just enabling and cultivating a consumer mentality? The second thing that we can create is a clergy centered ministry. And I would even include staff centered ministry. Some would say, professional. It would be a professionalism centered ministry. Pastors end up doing most of the work, or staff end up doing most of the work, or we will outsource our calling to other people or organizations. And the last thing that can happen is we can drift into spectator Christianity. And that's when people attend your church but don't engage. They consume, but they don't contribute. And so, Ryan, where do you see signs of spectator Christianity today? What are some of your own personal experiences, maybe recently or just in the years past?
I when I think spectator Christianity, I mean that is a real easy one to fall into, because when you become a spectator, you don't really see yourself falling into that slot. It's just something that kind of happens over time. No, you're doing what you think you're supposed to be doing, which is attending on Sunday.
Mm,
And I think that's the mistake people make there. God does not just live in the church, He's
mm,
with us at all times, everywhere. So just because you're there on Sunday and you're enjoying the sermon, you're enjoying the music, and then you go off through the week to do whatever you need to do, that's you're a spectator. You're not engaging.
mm.
You know, yeah.
Yeah, something that comes to my mind is, if we're not careful, what ends up happening is we create a very shallow um, shallow faith, a shallow practice that what ends up happening is when things change and they're not the way that we like them, we leave. I think that's a big one when I think about spectator Christianity. If we were to remove a couple of things or change them and they would be differently, would we be tempted to just stop going to the church that we're currently at? And to me, that's just a sign of really there's no further commitment. There's no buy-in, and so it's almost like um, we have a foot in the water, but we will never jump in. We're okay with having our feet in the water, uh, but Jesus is like, hey, you need to come to the middle. That's where the good stuff is. You need to jump in the middle. You need to swim. You need to wade the water, and but I think it's very easy. But no, we see this a lot, and it's not confined to one or two churches. No, this is everywhere. There's some people who attend church. They'll go to a large church because they know that they can be a fly on the wall.
Yeah,
That's why.
yeah,
Um, uh, you know, people people are content with coming to church on Sunday morning and not being engaged with anything else. And I think part of that is you know there's a lot of other priorities. Right? People have their routines. They have their other plans, the things they spend their money on, and so forth. But it's easy to just come on a Sunday morning. So I think there's a lot of things that we see in the church that would be considered spectator Christianity, um, and on top of that, uh, it's I would also say, you ever been to a basketball game? So I remember I used to run the clock in the town or where I served before, and it's funny. So being on the floor, I got to talk with the refs a lot, and I got to see things up close. And so refs would make good calls, and man, people on the backs just start yelling and trashing the ref, and I'm like, man, I would have called the same thing. And but what ends up happening is I think even in spectator Christianity, if we're not careful, it's easy to critique from afar, but never be willing to be like. Well, spectator Christianity likes to point out problems, but never wants to volunteer to be part of the solution.
yeah.
And hence why I say, there will be a tendency to move on to the next church or to the next church or to the next church because of whatever. But church, listen to us. We are not here just to receive. We receive in order to be sent. Because, you know, that seems silly. Why would we come on Sunday morning to receive prayer, to receive communion, to receive a message, to receive encouragement, inspiration, motivation, and just to keep it to ourselves? Uh, just to keep it to ourselves, right? If anything, it would have been better not to come on Sunday because nothing would have changed. And so, we've been called to shift from audience to participants. from consumers to contributors, from those who gather to those who are sent. And so, what does this look like practically? Well, I think the first thing that we need to do is we need to normalize calling for everyone. And I think one of the best ways that we begin to cultivate and change the culture that we're in is through our everyday language. You know, our conversations, what are we talking about? And are we thinking carefully about the words that we use? For example, uh, are we asking questions like, where's God calling you this week? How are you discipling right now? How are you living on mission? Right? Rather than just the typical conversation that we like to have, hey, how are you doing? How was your week? Anything different? You know, we can talk for 30 minutes to an hour, and if we're not careful, we won't even bring God up or his mission while we're in the church, which almost seems strange to me. If anything, that'd be one of the most important things that we should be talking about. And so it's important that this becomes a part of our everyday language, because calling becomes expected, not just an exception. I think the second thing is we need to connect calling to our everyday lives. You know, calling is not just preaching or going on a mission trip or volunteering for different leadership roles inside the church. It includes parenting. So, you parents out there, God has given you children with the responsibility to make them disciples of Jesus. And so, what are they hearing from you? What are they seeing from you? Uh, Also, it includes teaching. All the teachers out there, farming, coaching, and friendships. It's calling is everywhere because our mission field is where we already are. All it takes is to see it as such. And so, here's a question: where has God already placed us that we may be overlooking as a mission field? Any thoughts on that, Ryan?
I think the honest answer there is it's probably everywhere. Everywhere we already are. You know, kind of like what you said with your families, your kids, our homes, our workplace, our neighbors. You know, even during our regular routines, you're at the gym, you're getting coffee. You know, those places we overlook because they feel ordinary.
Mm,
But that's really the point, ain't it? That's the ordinary way.
mm,
You know, it's the people we see every day. You know, our coworkers, our neighbors, our parents, our siblings, our kids. You know, those are relationships where real discipleship can actually happen. And I think people overlook it because when you hear calling, you know, you kind of expect the calling to take you somewhere new, somewhere
mm,
different, somewhere, you know, you that feels like a mission,
mm.
but you overlook the mission you're already in.
Right,
You know, when God is saying, I've already sent you, you're just not seeing it yet.
right.
So I think a better question might be, you know, what would change if we started seeing our everyday life as the mission?
Mm, yeah. No, I agree. You know, I've heard some fantastic people share testimonies. You know, I have a good friend, and you know he works full time, and you know one of the things that he recognizes about his job, because he helps a lot of people, is you know he's not only there to minister to them and whatever physical thing that needs to be fixed or repaired, replaced, or anything like that, but also in the conversation and interactions that he has relationally with these individuals. And so It's easy to avoid everyone if that is what we want. And I think there's a lot of people that's what we want. We want to avoid everyone, but uh, discipleship, Christianity, Jesus is saying that no. If anything, we go out of our way to interact with people because we're on mission. We're sent, and I think you're exactly right, Ryan. Recognizing even some of the simplest things. When when we're at the coffee shop. Maybe our mission field is the barista in front of us. Maybe it's the person that we find ourselves sitting next to. Sometimes our mission field are the people around us that we just need to have our eyes open, our ears open to recognize them. When someone's crying, or where it seems someone is overwhelmed with a burden or the weight of life circumstances, um, or a tragedy has happened, and you know are we willing to intentionally engage this individual in such a way that we can extend God's love and grace to them? And so, uh, there really is a lot. And I think there are things constantly, right? Doors that are constantly being opened every single day, every single moment. All we need to do is just have, I think, the eyes to recognize it for what it is. Because again, right, if we want to ignore it, we can. We totally can. But what if we began to look at every single moment, every single interaction, um, mission oriented? Of hey, is God calling me to speak to this individual, to pray with this individual? Shoot, you don't even have to pray with them. Maybe it's just pray for them separately.
Yeah.
It's, why not? Or right there. Sometimes maybe the thing that God's calling you to do to minister to people is to do it anonymously. And so the third thing that I think we can do practically is I think as the church, we need to create pathways to discover calling. Right? It's one thing to talk about it. It's one thing to connect it with what we're already doing. But what are the pathways to help those discover their calling? And maybe this involves, spiritual gifts conversations. Every single person has spiritual gifts. Uh, we just don't know how to articulate it, or we're not even aware what might be our spiritual gifts. And there's a lot of resources out there, taking a spiritual gifts inventory. And imagine if you did that with your entire church and you recognized quickly, um, what what were the strengths of the church, and maybe what were the areas that the church lacked, and not because, oh well, we need to find these people. Well, no, it's just to recognize, hey, this is where our strengths are. And now, what are some great ways for us to live on mission within these spiritual gifts? I think along with that, mentoring relationships. Right now, I'm mentoring two young men, and we're going through the master plan of evangelism. I don't know if y'all have ever heard it. You heard me talk about it a couple of times previously, but one of the things that um, you know Robert Coleman talks about is setting an example and demonstrating, encouraging, and empowering those who follow behind us. Um, Another way to create pathways is through serving and reflecting rhythms. I know sometimes we do something so quickly that we don't take time to stop and reflect. And it's funny, right? Robert Coleman would call this supervision, right? There's not a time for supervision or just to share, reflect, to be offered guidance and continued encouragement and support. And I think another pathway to help us discover calling is through sharing our testimonies. I think there's a lot of people in church who have never shared their testimony, or they don't know how to articulate testimony. And I would say, testimony isn't just right. We're not just talking about the testimony of when God drew you to Himself and you said yes to Him, but I'm talking about every moment where you recognize God moving in and around you or through you. And maybe it was something that directly affected you, or maybe it was something that directly affected someone else. But creating a way for us to share these testimonies so that um, maybe they spark something of how we can live on mission. Because we will only discover calling by doing. And I'm not trying to say that you need to do. I'm just saying that there comes a point where we've thought about something enough. Now it's time to practice. And there's some things that you can't learn uh, just through theory, just reading in a book. There's things that you have to experience firsthand to grow, to strengthen, and to adapt. And so, last thing I want to say is calling is not just about purpose. It's about people, and I think this is a really important one because if we're not careful, uh, we will put we will put our own individual callings and mission that are task oriented above the people that our ministries and our mission are aimed towards. Which is right. It seems pretty silly, right? That we would disregard people uh, in place of these ministries and missions and programs. And so, remember, calling is not just about our purpose; it's about people. Our mission is still the same as it has always been. It is go and make disciples. And so, Ryan, do you have any last comments for our audience before we sign off?
I would say, just remember, calling isn't about adding something new to our lives. It's looking at our lives and seeing our lives differently. It's realizing God isn't waiting for us somewhere else. He's already placed us exactly where He wants to use us. So think about the question. It's not am I called? It's am I paying attention to where He's already sending me? So just think on it.
Mm. No, that's a great word, and I do want to leave you all who are listening in with a challenge. Who are you helping follow Jesus? Who? Maybe there's someone already um, that you know. Maybe there's someone God is placing on your heart at the moment. But I would encourage you to pray because there's probably someone who does need your help, not someone else, right? Don't, well, someone else will do it. No, no. Again, God has called you. God has called you specifically to help someone else specifically to follow Him. And so, are you going to answer that call? Our prayer is that you will. But until next time, y'all be blessed.
God bless.